of you may be seeing this and perhaps now realizing that yes, it has been 6 months since the first set of lockdowns was imposed. It's been a time where timings have blurred, everything has blurred, months have sort of melted from one into the other as our lives have changed. I want to begin this program by talking about the impact this has had on our economy and on businesses, because that has sort of led to a domino effect on what has affected India in so many ways. To speak on this, I'm pleased to be joined this evening by Jahangir Aziz, of course, JP Morgan, Sangita Reddy, President FICCI, and Swaminathan Aiyar, Consulting Editor, ET Now. Great to have all of you on the show. Jahangir, I want to get your take first on the last 6 months. We know the big number, minus 24%, Q1 GDP contraction for India. We know all of the projections which range from say about 9% to 14% for how much India will contract. I want to ask you, in hindsight, was there any other way we were going to go with the kind of lockdown we had?
Look, I find this question ironical. It is a public health crisis. It was a public health failure. And you're asking a bunch of economists, what was the solution to fighting the virus? And I find it, it's like akin to going in 2008, asking a bunch of public health officials how to solve the subprime problem. I have no idea whether that was the right way of going about it, whether there was any alternative. It has to be something that you have to address public health officials, and you have to address the Ministry of Health in the government of India, whether or not there was an alternative strategy. All we can see is that, what every other country has done. Every other country had some form of partial lockdown, whether that lockdown was necessary, whether the lockdown was the right way of doing things, whether there was some alternative ways. That's not something that I, as an economist, have any clue, actually. I mean, I can pontificate about it if you want me to, but I really do not have any clue.
That's not what I asked you, Jahangir. That's not what I asked you, Mr. Aziz. That's not what I asked you. And in fact, ahead on the show, I have Dr. Vinod Paul, who's a member of the Niti Aayog, and I will put the public health question to him. My question to you is, and I'm not asking whether the lockdown was correct or not, because that is a policy decision which, as you said, is not in your expert domain. But considering the severity of the lockdown, was there any way to avoid this minus 24%? Considering that as a nation of our size, we had to go into that severe lockdown, was this economic situation and the economic fallout unavoidable?
Look, if you're going to lock down 75% of the economy, you're going to have a massive impact on the economy. And that where the impact should have been minus 24 or minus 25, that's something that you can debate. I think the manner in which the lockdown had an impact had to do with policy choices. And if you look at countries which are similar kinds of infection rate, let's say per million, and here, the country that comes closest to mind is Brazil, who had probably a higher rate of infection per million. And Brazil had, a very difficult and huge difficulty in trying to put together a program by which they could separate mobility from infection rate. And there, the impact on the economy in that quarter was half that of India. So on a quarter-on-quarter basis, India declined by 67%, the second largest in the world, lower just than Peru. Brazil, on the other hand, fell by about 35%. And if you look at the policy options, the gap between Brazil and India was almost entirely explained by the fact that in Brazil, despite fiscal being a much greater problem in Brazil, they opted for a significant amount of fiscal support through income support, not through spending in infrastructure, not doing things which you really cannot do in a lockdown, but just providing income support, particularly to what in Brazil is called the Bolsa Familia families, which would be equivalent to the BPL families in India. And that amount of income support has allowed Brazil, at least with a higher infection rate, to be able to limit the decline to about half the size of India. And I'm going to stop in 1 minute. And just as an implication of that, If you look at what the market analysts have done, they have continued to upgrade Brazil's growth. Brazil will still have a negative growth rate. Don't for a second believe that it won't have a negative growth rate. They have continued to upgrade Brazil's growth while they have continued to downgrade India's growth, and it's almost entirely due to that one policy decision that the fiscal support has been in the form of income support and not in the form of infrastructure and other spending.
Oh, that is the key point. And let me come to you, Ms. Sangita Reddy, on what the mood is in corporate India now 6 months later. I think for most entities and individuals, the initial confusion, shock, nervousness has been replaced with a kind of fortitude of, okay, we'll get through this and let's see how long it lasts. In corporate India, over time, it's seen as a more careful calibration of spending, a reduction in any kind of planned investment or expansion. And is that because of a continuing concern of whether the government will give a larger fiscal push?
So clearly, I think across the board, there has been first the aspect of everybody understood the reason for the lockdown. And I must state categorically that I think India needed that initial lockdown. The extent of the financial support, I think, must be looked in conjunction with the food support, the fact that, we were able to make sure that nobody starved, the initial reactions to the methodology, and the fact that, yes, some income support has been given as well. Coming directly to the mood of the nation, I think the FICCI Truba survey, which has been a significant one, we did the last survey was in June, and now we repeated it in August. We've seen a significant improvement in terms of, if you ask the extent of manufacturing, so many sectors have said, yes, they've brought this up to about 65, 70%. If you look at export orders, there is a certain uptick in those numbers. The complaints really are from the fact that the lockdowns are sporadic, the retail sector hasn't really kicked in, and most significantly, I think the consumption has not come back, demand has not come back, and consumer sentiment remains tepid. So considering these aspects, I think really what we're faced with right now is, of course, how do we contain the pandemic? And here, I think significant numbers. Of the 700 districts in India, only 60 are really a worry. So that's under 10%. The big win from the health sector side is the fact that mortality is really under control. I believe that this is really now the time, clearly and significantly, to completely open up, reverse isolate the vulnerable, continue the testing, stay the course in terms of treatment, and figure out every option possible to restart the economy, including demand stimulation.
Swaminathan, Aiyar, Jahangir Aziz has a point when he says that medical decisions and policy decisions are made by a set of experts. But in this particular case, and in the situation of the last 6 months, all of these policy decisions and the speed with which India's positive cases has grown has had a direct bearing on the economy and on the confidence that consumers have and businesses have. How do you look at our current situation where we are planning to open up more even as our cases are mounting?
Yes, well, I would say that certainly, this was not a question of a public health policy. This is a political decision. There are trade-offs always between what we do on the health side, what we do on the economic side. This is a political decision on which all of us are entitled to pontificate because it is a political matter. India opted for the most stringent lockdown. On a certain Oxford Research Index, we were 100. So we opted for the most stringent lockdown and one of the smallest fiscal stimuli, less than 2% of GDP. The combined result was the biggest fall in GDP. And did you solve the health problem? I would say that, it was a mistaken political decision in terms of the trade-off. a very stringent lockdown was put in place on the ground that, this will help reduce the spread of the infection and give us time to gear up for a very large number of cases. Other countries were able to do just as well on that front with much less stringency and with a much larger fiscal stimulus. So I would say on both those two counts, the policy was misinformed, the policy was wrong. At that time itself, I wrote that, this support that you're trying to give to the poor and the public is peanuts. Other people are like, let's triple it through the Jan Dhan Yojana, the various other things. And the extent of the lockdown, how can this kind of strict lockdown work in a country where people are sleeping 6 to 10 to a room, where there are extremely crowded gullies, where it is really impossible to abolish contact? I mean, yes, you can try and reduce contact in some places, but in other places, it is physically impossible to actually practice social distancing in Indian conditions. Therefore, I would say that, overall, we have to say that, look, it was a mistake to have such a stringent lockdown. It was a mistake to have such a conservative fiscal policy. It is time to reverse both of them. I mean, I've been saying this for the last several months, and I can only repeat it once again. Please let us there is still plenty of time. Nirmala Sitharaman said, there is plenty of months left in the year. We can still give the fiscal push. Please go ahead and give that fiscal push and push the money out to people through the various routes. But then, I would include all of them. I would include directly giving it through the Jan Dhan accounts, PM Kisan, Nanrega, additional infrastructure. Let go on all of those. And don't worry that much about the fiscal consequences. As for the lockdowns, frankly, they have not worked. So on that, you need to focus on minimizing lockdowns rather than maximizing stringency. If you do this, we will gradually recover. But I would say it's very clear that, you compare us with various other developing countries, we have suffered a much bigger fall. We now need to get this much faster recovery than them. As of now, while there are some signs of recovery, it is not as strong as in some other countries. China, of course, is way ahead of everybody else. So I would say, yes, we got it wrong. Please reverse those policies. Let's have the minimum lockdown and let's have much, much more fiscal spending.
Jahangir Aziz, I want to get your take on the recovery that we've seen since the month of June. Now, in the month of June, most of your indicators showed a fairly sharp bounce back, and that was perhaps expected since you went from a completely locked up economy to one which opened, and gradually that has increased. But is that recovery a steady, sustainable one? Because it seems to have been a little shaky in August as well as September. How do you look at this period, June onwards?
So if you look at, mobility indicator, for example, the Apple mobility indicators, I think for the last 6 weeks, the Apple mobility indicators have surprised us on the upside, both in the case of Brazil as well as the case of India. As you said, the Apple indicator the mobility indicators did jump up in the initial months just after the lockdown was removed, and then it sort of stabilized. But I think in the last, I would say 6 weeks, things have actually started to pick up. But I think at the same time, one has to recognize that globally, and it's not just in India, it is also in the case of China, which was the first in, first out countries in North Asia. Much of the recovery, in fact, almost all of the recovery that we've seen so far in growth terms as well as in level terms has been happening in the manufacturing sector. If you look at the services sector did pick up very, very smartly in the first few months of opening up the economy. Then it has almost in all places stabilized or has been moving up very, very slowly. And to a large extent, that reflects the inability of us to be able to de-link mobility with infection rate. Every time we have increased mobility in any place, doesn't really matter which part of the world you're talking about, infection rates have gone up. And with the infection rate going up, we've had partial to semi-partial lockdowns taking place and restrictions on activity. And I think that's been one of the reasons as to why services recovery, both in terms of growth as well as in terms of level, has not been as much as in the manufacturing sector. So we are likely to go through till we get a vaccine, and the vaccine is actually, people do get vaccinated, and, probably is going to take way into 2021 for that to happen. We are probably going to see this dual pace of recovery, where manufacturing recovers, services does not recover as strongly, and in most likelihood, perhaps barring China, China is perhaps the only country that in the end of 2021 will not have an incomplete recovery. I think almost all the economies in the world will have an incomplete recovery by the time end of 2021. That incomplete recovery, much of it will be because of the fact that services sector, which is a very large portion of our economy in the case of India, will be the one that will lag behind manufacturing. In the case of India, I think, given the policy choices that the government has made, we are looking at an additional risk that in 2021, when the economy actually starts recovering because of the vaccine, et cetera, let's say second half of 2021, we might actually run into this problem where our households and our SMEs now have completely damaged balance sheets because of the massive income shocks that they've seen in 2021 and 2020 and the lack of government support or income support. I mean, RBI can extend forbearance as much as they want to, but in reality, those damages in the balance sheets will be there. And with damaged balance sheets, as Swami, he's been looking at emerging market countries even longer than I have. Damaged balance sheets is the one thing that emerging market countries do not want to have, because it takes a very, very long time for emerging markets to recover from damaged balance sheets. We can recover from damaged growth and damaged demand quite quickly, but balance sheet damage, this takes a very, very long time.
Right. Swami, why do you think that there is this hesitation to spend for this fiscal push? We're all waiting for the next round of it, but where do you think that policy hesitation is coming from?
The economic reason given is that there are doubts as to whether people are in a spending mood. And if you push money out, perhaps people won't spend it. I understand that, the precautionary motive will be stronger, but still, that would apply to countries across the board. And nevertheless, countries have done it. So yes, all the money will not be quickly spent. But nevertheless, you need to push it out. There is some talk of, can you give it in the form of vouchers that will expire in 1 week or expire in 1 month, so that people have to spend that money or they don't get it. I mean, that kind of voucher system, I think we are not administratively in a position to reach the bulk of the population. You can try that out. But beyond that, it's a very weak thing. Secondly, there was this concern about what happens to our debt GDP. I mean, if we have this huge fall in nominal GDP and this huge rise in debt, we have already crossed perhaps 90% in terms of debt to GDP. Our interest rates are among the highest in the world. So 90% of GDP for us is much, much higher than for the USA or UK or for China, because our interest rates are so much higher. So I think there was, on the fiscal side, there was this conservatism of, are we getting the debt to GDP too high? Here again, I would say, let it go. And while inflation is not normally considered a good thing, please remember, inflation is also to some extent solving the problem of debt to GDP, because nominal GDP will be rising with the inflation. So I would say the reasons why the government has been conservative: one, they were worried about whether or not you can spend the money. Secondly, they were worried about what is the impact on government debt. I think both of these are highly exaggerated concerns. We need to break out of that mold and think much more boldly.
So I would like to add...
Ms. Sangita Reddy, I want your take, which is forward-looking one. Yes, go ahead.
So I want to begin by adding that I completely agree that the conservative approach in terms of demand stimulation is something that needs to be reversed and reversed now. But I think it's also important for us to note that there are some beginnings of the green shoots, whether it's the PMI manufacturing and services. This had touched a historic low of 27 and 5.4 respectively in April, and I think it's recovered to a certain degree to 52 and 41.8. And then whether you look at the index of industrial production, the gradual pickup in the e-way bill volumes, the revenue earning on the freight, all these are beginnings of indicators. So I think the fact that even the CMIE, and that actually employment is the biggest concern, or unemployment is really the biggest concern. And the rate for the week ended September reported at 6.3%, which is, it's getting much better than it was, because we did see a significant scenario in the pre-COVID levels. So this unemployment rate, which had reached a high of 27% in the week of May, I think has now come down. So some of these factors are beginning to show positivity. This is the perfect time and the significant time for the government to introduce demand stimulation. Whether it's direct money into Jan Dhan accounts, money into the women's accounts, I still believe, and FICCI has strongly recommended the use of consumption, vouchers. I think there are methodologies and mechanisms to do this. I also believe we should seriously consider an urban Manrega scheme. Besides this, all the other things that we have recommended include, something like an entry or a low-end pricing interest on the housing loans. Because if we can get the construction sector moving, you'll have 200 other sectors and employment stimulated because of it. Besides this, I believe there are a range of steps that we can and should take. Whether it's ensuring that money which is owed to MSMEs and to all other corporates. Also, I think we need to take this as an opportunity for the future to build back India, and not build back, but really build future. And towards that, looking at what are the digital gains we've made and how can we enhance them. I think there's a huge and very significant work being done on the value of data and how data and AI can contribute to a $500 billion economy. What is our export strategy going forward? How can the government front-end spending on infrastructure and accelerate whatever's in the budget right now so that also is a kicker? So there are still many levers. And in addition to that, if the government does demand stimulation, I think India still has the chance to make a quick recovery. It's clearly not a V-shaped recovery, but at least a faster U would be something that we would all look forward to. And I believe it's important to keep the sentiment up, to stay positive, to think innovation, and find ways that industry, government, the regulator, the banks all work together towards this positive future for the country. And most importantly,
absolutely. I will have to end it there, but I want to thank you so much. Yes. I want to thank you so much, Ms. Reddy, for joining us today on the show, as well as Jahangir Aziz and Swaminathan Aiyar.